and we're live.
All right. I'm just looking to turn off my sound here. How do I do that? Hello, everyone. Good evening. On behalf of the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Memorial Week, I want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight for our event. And thank you so much for continuing to support Holocaust education as well. Tonight, it's my great honor and privilege to introduce you to our keynote speaker, one of our keynote speakers, Dr. Paul Bartrop. And Dr. Bartrop was and still is my mentor and good friend, so I'm very happy to have him with us here tonight. Dr. Bartrop is a multi-award winning scholar of the Holocaust and genocide studies. Until December of 2020, he was professor of history and director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Research at Florida Gulf Coast University here in Fort Myers, Florida. He is now a visiting professorial fellow at the University of South Wales in Canberra, Australia. He has held numerous other positions as a distinguished visiting professor, fellow, and scholar in residence at various institutions around the world, including, but not limited to, the University of South Australia, the Jewish Holocaust Center in Melbourne, Australia, the Martin Springer Institute for Teaching the Holocaust, Tolerance, and Humanitarian Values at Northern Arizona University, and Virginia Commonwealth University. He's previously been the Ida E. King Distinguished Visitor Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Richard Stockton College, which is in New Jersey. Excuse me, there I got tongue-tied. In Australia, he also taught at the University of South Australia, Monash University. He is the author or editor of 24 books and counting. Some of the most recent are Children of the Holocaust, Heroines of Vichy France, Rescuing French Jews During the Holocaust, Perpetuating the Holocaust, Leaders, Enablers, and Collaborators, the Evian Conference of 1938 and the Jewish Refugees Crisis, The Holocaust, a Resource and Document Collection, which is 4 volumes, and those are just the most recent. His major edited work, The Routledge History of the Second World War, is currently in production with the publisher, and it's due for release later on this year. And in addition, he's published numerous scholarly articles in journals and books. He's been a member of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and was for many years the Australian representative on the International Committee of the Annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust and the Churches. Among other positions, he is a member of the editorial advisory board of the journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and a member of the advisory board of the Genocide Education Project of California. Dr. Bartrop is a former vice president of the Midwestern Jewish Studies Association and is a past president of the Australian Association of Jewish Studies. And then in his free time, he lectures. So, as we're going through the evening, if you come up with any questions that you want to ask Dr. Bartrop, please feel free to put those into the YouTube chat and we will moderate and relay those back to him. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Paul Bartrop. After you, sir.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a very long introduction of who I am and what I do. I'm a little fearful that it might have been another presentation all by itself. But we'll see where we go over the next little while with this presentation, looking at liberation and reflections of by survivors of the Nazi concentration camps. I'm looking at the end of the concentration camp experience as it was viewed by those who survived it. I've employed personal testimonies, personal accounts to build what I refer to as a composite picture, if you like, of how newly liberated prisoners confronted the challenge, or the challenges of freedom, and how they look back at the period of their ordeal. Now, it should be said there were very few consistent motives underlying the will to survive. For some, as we'll see, it was based on a spirit of revenge. But for others, different impulses included a quest or a hope for reunions with lost family members, a desire to bear witness. This was something that came through fairly frequently. A spiritual quest for the ideal, the very ideal of freedom itself, and for some, a religious commitment to live, to remain alive in order to serve God. As a religious commitment is something that I'd like to talk to you about as well. Bottom line was that once the camps had been freed, prisoners had to face up to what freedom would entail. So when prisoners were released, their emotions were, not surprisingly, quite diverse. So I wanted to look at what testimonies from the time, as we encounter them now, several decades later, tell us about how prisoners who had survived the camps embraced their freedom and their survival. Today, I should say this evening, it's morning here in Australia, I'll briefly examine several themes. Leaving the camps, the urge to survive, luck, freedom, revenge, religious belief, and how prisoners viewed the human condition in the aftermath of their horrible experience. We'll see a number of expressions related by survivors of what that experience meant to them. Now, the very first thing I'd like to talk about with you relates to the process of leaving the camps. Those prisoners who were still alive in the camps in Eastern Europe at the end of 1944 and early 1945 were evacuated in what were referred to as death marches, so as not to fall into the hands of the advancing Soviets. Vast numbers of people died. Died is not quite the right word. Often were murdered while they were en route. They had to contend with the bitter cold, fatigue, hunger, as well as the SS guards, and as well also as their own debilitated condition after having been in the camps already. These were survivors, let's face it. For those who had already reached the limit of their endurance, these death marches had but one outcome. Most accounts of this time relate stories of horror, degradation, and sudden death at the hands of the guards. Now, in what I've got coming up over the course of the next little while are a number of personal accounts as expressed, direct quotes from the survivor testimonies themselves. Unfortunately, I don't have a range of voices that I could tap into to distinguish their own voices from mine. So I'll be doing a lot of things saying quote unquote. Bear with me on that as we proceed. I want to talk for a start about the testimony of a woman from Norway. She had been imprisoned at Auschwitz and then moved to the women's camp at Ravensbrück. And she left a graphic testimony of her evacuation from Auschwitz to Ravensbrück. And I'll read it to you direct from her words. She wrote, "The camp of Auschwitz was evacuated on January 15, 1945. All had to go. Thousands of prisoners were driven along the snow-covered roads by German SS soldiers. There were no doctors, no nurses, no medicine. Those who could not walk were shot. The prisoners walked for 3.5 days. Many froze to death or had their hands and feet frostbitten. Many died from exhaustion. When the transport finally arrived at Ravensbrück, they had to stand for 1.5 days in a street behind the camp hospital. There was no room for them in the barrack blocks. The camp was overfull already." Unquote. We've got a testimony also from somebody who was on the same march. This other prisoner wrote afterwards, or related afterwards, quote, all awareness of reality began to fade, for the frost, the sleepiness, and the weakness acted like a narcotic, unquote. They were in fact in some sort of almost an ethereal dream world, but a dream that was a nightmare world in reality. As the ordeal lengthened, sustenance became an even greater problem than it had been in the camp. As one prisoner related afterwards about her death march, they drove us on, continually promising a halt, a rest. Another mile, they said, a few more steps. We had nothing to eat or drink but snow. The frost increased. The road became as smooth and slippery as glass. Acrobatic feats were necessary so as not to twist one's ankle. At one point, my supplies of energy gave out. So did my capacity for controlling my muscles. I felt I could not take another step. Unquote. This was, let's face it, a shared experience. It offered no respite. Many prisoners tragically gave up, having gone to the absolute limit of their strength. But for others, the idea that they were at last out from behind the barbed wire was sufficient. That was sufficient to rekindle thoughts of liberation. They were outside. One woman later wrote, I'll quote her direct. She said, if we broke free, and then it would dawn on me, at this moment, it would take no more than a single act, a single decision to win the greatest freedom one could have in our age, in our corner of the world. As soon as I slipped out from under the bayonets, I would be standing outside the entire system. I might win only a few days, more likely a few hours, but it would be a freedom millions didn't even dream about. I would belong nowhere. I would belong to nothing. No one would know I existed. All the rules and prohibitions would no longer apply to me. I would be outside of it all. When they caught me, I would be like a wind trapped in a sail, a bird shot in flight. But escape was, even from within the death march, was for most people this forlorn hope or possibility. The only reality to be faced was an ugly death, a sudden, unavoidable fact that was ultimately intended to be everybody's lot. At Bergen-Belsen in January 1945, one prisoner reflected that there was no dignity left in dying. Elsewhere, death was the natural thing, an occurrence which he wrote, meant salvation for those whom it visited. So within that context, and notwithstanding its closeness, the closeness of death, some prisoners paradoxically also felt that death would pass them by. This urge to survive is something I'd like to discuss now. At the end of the first day of a death march, for example, when the full reality of their situation hit them, an unquenchable optimism and thirst for life took hold. As one prisoner related, even then, after that horrific first day's march, no one really believed this was a diabolical plan completely to exterminate us. we fondly imagined that the weak and sick would fall by the way, and that the strong would find themselves in a new camp. No thought was given to the identity of those who had perished. What did it matter? Provided one was alive oneself. Now that opens up all sorts of can of worms as far as psychology is concerned that I don't want to go into at the present time, but for this particular prisoner, the ambition was survival for herself. I in fact counted one prisoner, I'm departing from my notes here, who related after the war that her fundamental rule was myself first, second, and third. Then myself again, and then everybody else. That was what one prisoner wrote. I recall that so vividly in my memory. Others even rejected the possibility of death and allowed themselves to be deluded by the Nazi stories of a positive future life. One prisoner recorded later, quote, "I preferred any lie 1,000 times, as long as it gave me a hope of surviving." Issues of life and death were not predictable. Prisoners found that the camps bearable or unbearable, death-ridden or life-affirming, depending on their own individual perspectives. Where one prisoner, for example, might state, quote, "To understand our daily calvary, you have to imagine a human condition in which every moment is unbearable," unquote. Whereas another prisoner could acknowledge that, quote, "Life was unbearable, yet it was borne, as there was still a spark of desperate hope of which we were not consciously aware," unquote. Different people have different perspectives on even the most horrendous experiences. Regardless of the ongoing daily torment, morning brought a new day, and evening saw that day's survival. A Polish prisoner at Birkenau in 1942 put it this way, quote, "There are certain matters which the mind slips hurriedly over. In the same way that the feet avoid the sick and dead lying on the ground, there are so many things you must take care of to make the next day in the field more bearable. At the moment you enter the gate when the sun sets, creating a bridge, your mind begins detailed plans of things to do that night, creating a bridge over reality. You live only for each day. On this purposeless pilgrimage, you walk like a blind man, groping from object to object, from morning to evening, putting all your energy into the maintenance of life throughout that day." That's a pretty powerful sort of statement, I think. And what about at the end of that day? A Soviet prisoner in Auschwitz reflected on this after a day's grueling labour on what's referred to as Außenarbeit, labour outside the camp, forced labour outside the camp. He wrote afterwards, he survived, and he wrote afterwards, tomorrow, June the 23rd, 1943, our nightmare would begin anew. But in the moment, I could strike some kind of balance. We had not been shot, but we were still condemned men. That was obvious. We were all earmarked for the crematorium. But that need not necessarily happen very soon. What mattered that we were alive, he emphasized. I could look up at the sky, breathe freely, and even enjoy a minute's rest. And that, he said, and that was not little. What do you think about that for a moment? Reflections of that kind, often glimpsed in a moment of respite, gave prisoners the hope they needed to keep going when all seemed lost. And the more they communicated their ideas to others, perhaps the better it would be for everyone. Optimism, no less than hopelessness, could be infectious. This spirit of going on, regardless of their trials, sometimes led certain inmates to speculate as to why it should have been so. And a wonderful testimony written by a man named Ellie, not Ellie Wiesel, Ellie Aaron Cohen. He was a Dutch Jewish doctor sent to Auschwitz. He had spent time in the transit camp in the Netherlands called Westerbork, and went off to Auschwitz. And he learned in the camp that his wife and son had been killed not long after their arrival. His intense grief was accompanied by an astonishment that hearing this news only served to help him go on fighting. Think about that. He didn't drop everything, he kept going. He wrote, in relation to this, he wrote afterwards, "There will undoubtedly have been those who didn't keep going once they knew. But I did. Nor did I see any others giving in. Everyone went on fighting again. That will to live," he wrote, this is his writing, "that will to live, that forcing yourself to carry on, that survives. It happens just like that. Of course, you got into a state of shock, and the shock was bigger for one man than for another. Oh, well," he said, "oh, well, I don't know, and I can't really explain it very clearly. I wanted to go on living. It isn't a noble attitude, maybe, but it's true. That's how it is." By the way, I love reading this stuff by Ellie Aaron Cohen. Can't remember the title of his, he left a book afterwards, but it's his testimony is filled with insights of that kind into his own personal perspectives on things, which are perhaps a little unexpected sometimes. For others, though, perhaps the accent was a little bit different. As one said, the accent was simply on hanging on to dear life and trying to find hope and courage beyond human power. That's an interesting thing itself. Many prisoners, let me say the following. Death in a concentration camp needs no explanation. Survival does. And for many people, regardless of what their motives or ambitions might have been about how they would deal with life in the camp or life after the camp or life at the time of liberation, for many people, the question was really one of luck. The only way they could explain how they managed to survive. We should never forget that once inside a camp, a prisoner's life was surrendered to the Nazis. They could do with a prisoner what they wished, even unto death. An inmate who was at Dachau put the issue, I think, quite succinctly. He said the concentration camps were only a macabre lottery. Those who held the lucky numbers were bound to get out. The others, of course, all lost. Quote unquote. Now, many years ago, an interviewer in the United States, a woman named Dorothy Rabinowitz, interviewed a number of Holocaust survivors. And she spoke to one survivor who articulated, I think, most thoroughly this notion of chance, this notion of luck. Dorothy Rabinowitz wrote, in talking about this, in writing about this particular survivor, and it's a lengthy quote, so bear with me. "Being spared was a matter of luck. She said it often. Smarter people than herself had tried to figure out ways to stay alive, They had devoted themselves day and night to the task of planning how they would survive this way and that. Brilliant people they'd been, some of them, and they'd been killed anyway. It was luck, because if you thought of 1,000 years, you could not have planned your way out of the situations she'd been in. No planning could have devised the steps that impulse and accident had provided to save her. In addition, this is the continuation of her quote, in addition, the more experience one had of being saved, the more one believed in the possibility of being saved. The more one saw of one's own good fortune, the less accidental it appeared. It began to seem bound somehow to the way in which one's life was supposed to go. Unquote. It's a lengthy quote, but it's filled with insight, I think. Putting it slightly differently, a French woman imprisoned at Ravensbrück addressed the issue further when summing up why she lived on after the Nazis had gone. She wrote, "The fact that I survived Ravensbrück I owe first and most definitely to chance, then to anger, and the motivation to reveal the crimes I had witnessed, and finally to a union of friendship, since I had lost the instinctive and physical desire to live." Little personal advert here. Many years ago, I wrote a book called Surviving the Camps. The subtitle was Unity in Adversity During the Holocaust. I looked at that notion, the last one she referred to as by way of a union of friendship. I looked at the ways in which prisoners banded together in spite of the ambitions of the Nazis to force everybody into some sort of war of all against all. I actually found, by listening to the survivors, although survival could never be guaranteed, but to get through each day, if possible, they would help each other where possible. That was at least what they were telling me. What, perhaps, in the prisoners' minds was that freedom for which they yearned? That's also something to think about. What was the nature of freedom after living sometimes for years, often for years, under this terrible, terrible condition in the concentration camps? Seeing such degradation around them, seeing such devaluing of human life. Well, one woman, Sabrina Schmidluska, a Polish woman, not Jewish, was sent to Birkenau in 1942 and remained there until she was liberated by the Russians in January 1945. She was one of the very last survivors in the camp in January 1945. She remembered the notion of freedom, that freedom for which everybody was hoping. She remembered the following way, quote, "Freedom is some kind of country or planet, unbelievably beautiful, where every prisoner lived for a time. They tell each other about it. They reminisce. In the long, sleepless hours, they dream of each happening that took place. They relive it intensely. They conduct imaginary conversations with people who remained on that planet called freedom. They beg those folks to wait for their return. They cultivate that lost land in their hearts." Stopping the quote there. Her book is not an easy one to get hold of. If you're simply looking for a book called Smoke Over Birkenau, she's got lots of wonderful insights there, not only about explaining about her experience, but also insights like that, reflecting on this notion there, in this instance, of what freedom was. Some prisoners longed for the arrival of freedom simply to be able to show that victory had been achieved. Victory over the Nazis, victory over the fate that was intended for them. And seen in that light, by hanging on and hanging on and hanging on in the camp, evacuation and a death march seemed like a cruel joke played by fate at the very end. A Jewish prisoner from Hungary, Dr. Gisela Perl, expressed her comments this way. Looking at being put onto a death march, she reflected, "This was not how I imagined it. During the interminable months waiting for the day of liberation, I had seen myself again and again leading my fellow sufferers to freedom. I'd seen myself walking ahead of them, laughing, singing songs of freedom, a human being going out to meet other human beings with gratitude and dignity to thank them for our liberation." Well, this was not the way that she left Auschwitz, and this was some measure of anguish for her. To be able to leave the camp under one's own power was considered a victory. As one prisoner related, so many others, let's face it, so many others had left by the only other means possible, as smoke via the chimney of the gas chamber. Little wonder that for many prisoners emerging alive from the camp was a cause to be, as one prisoner wrote, happy, simply happy. For others, however, liberation had an altogether different meaning. Freedom could bring the opportunity to exact revenge on those who brought the inmates into their current condition, to reassert their humanity by reducing that of the Nazis. For example, one prisoner argued, while in the camp, "Before I die, one of them must." Or as another one said, relating to their fate at the end, "I have only one ambition left, and that is to become a guard over the Nazis." Not for long, she wrote, not for long, just a year or so. As if to underscore the point that this was not simple chatter, but serious talk of retribution. The words of a member of the Auschwitz Sonderkommando, the prisoners who were forced to work in the gas chamber crematoria complex itself. I think these words will suffice. He wrote, "I don't want to live for the sake of living. I have no one. They gassed my whole family. I just want revenge. I just want revenge." Now, how typical such thoughts were for all prisoners is hard to tell. And it's very, very important that for all of the things I've been saying here, we have to take into account the question of representativeness, the nature of how representative these quotes are of the entire prisoner experience. This is something we can't tell. At the very outset, I spoke about how I'd been putting together a composite picture. And I did that from a very wide range of accounts from survivors. I should just explain here, my city of Melbourne, Australia, not Melbourne, Florida, my city of Melbourne, Australia, has the highest proportion of Holocaust survivors now and their families within the Jewish community of any Jewish community in the world outside of Israel. As a consequence, we've had, no longer, a very rich community of memories from survivors. Maybe 50% of the Melbourne Jewish community are either survivors, less so now, but worse, of survivor families, the second into the third generation. And one person's view might be very different to another. The issue relates specifically to how representative each one might be of a broad range of other perspectives. Take into account, for example, how typical these thoughts are that I've been relating. But we might consider that perhaps every prisoner at one time or another at least felt resentment, and that this could build to a point where, for many people, ideas of revenge at least crossed their mind. Anyone who has been slighted in any sort of way will once say, I'm going to get back at that person. For some, these feelings spilled over into concrete action. For others, traditional forms of coping, such as postponement or transferal of anger into another direction, were employed. For many people, in trying to make sense of it all, trying to find a search for meaning, their traditional views, perhaps, of religion were reinforced. For others, trying to make sense of it all, their views of their search for meaning was a denial of traditional religious perspectives. In the blackness of the camps, in the darkness of the camps, where death ruled and the Nazis' intention was that all moral values would be turned upside down, it has to ask the question, it doesn't hurt to ask the question, did religion play any role in sustaining the inmates? To what degree, moreover, did they even think about such things? Now, an entire library has been created considering questions of theodicy, considering the Holocaust. Why do the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper? Where was God at Auschwitz? All that sort of stuff. But relatively little work has been done examining just how the prisoners themselves viewed questions of religious belief while they were in the camps themselves. I was talking to a student recently, a former student recently, who had done advanced graduate work looking at religious views within the Warsaw Ghetto. That's fine. That's pioneer. That's cutting edge stuff that she was doing. Within the camps themselves, a bit more difficult to locate. While some Jews and Christians certainly prayed and engaged in religious rituals wherever they could within the camps, as Ellie Wiesel discussed the notion of fasting on Yom Kippur, and people are already starving. Some nonetheless retained and maintained their commitment to such things. That said, at least among the survivors that I encountered, few people left accounts in which they said that they did maintain their religious rituals, and many turned their back altogether on belief. Any accounts that I encountered dealing with the issue at all did so through denying the existence of God in the camps rather than affirming the divine presence, affirming God's presence, or conceding that religion played any part in their survival. What might be said later was not necessarily the case, not necessarily the same as what was felt by inmates in the camps at the time. Take, for example, one woman. We know her as Elizabeth Kaye. She was a survivor interviewed by Dorothy Rabinowitz. I mentioned before Dorothy Rabinowitz, who did some interviews several decades ago with survivors. And this woman, Elizabeth Kaye, said when she was speaking with Dorothy Rabinowitz, "Do not mistake me," she said. "I'm not an unbeliever. I always had faith in a superpower, but not a Jewish God. If there was one, how could this have happened? You see," she said, "you see, I cannot get it through my head that God would try to punish 6 million Jews. A superpower, yes. Without that, I could not have survived." Interesting perspective. Likewise, Elie Wiesel, I mentioned Elie Wiesel. Most people know something a little bit about Elie Wiesel. He did not at first deny God's existence. Only, he said, God's absolute justice. Elsewhere, Elie Wiesel said he felt revolt rise up in me. Why should I bless his name? The eternal Lord of the universe, the all-powerful and terrible, was silent. What had I had him to thank for? What had I to thank him for? And of course, with that in mind, it's worthwhile bearing in mind, every Jewish prayer begins with a blessing over God. Here's Elie Wiesel saying that. Better off. Early in 1945, as the Nazis launched a starvation campaign against the prisoners at the Buchenwald subcamp of Neustadt, a prisoner then, a teenager, Helena Berenbaum, remembered that, I use her words here, she deliberately and with relish declared revenge on that God who had been believed in at the home of my parents, but who had deserted us in all our misery, and who here in the Nazi concentration camps had proved to be an invention of fraudulent priests who ordered us to love and respect him and fear his justice. That's pretty angry. Teenager. Another youngster in Theresienstadt in what was then Czechoslovakia, confided to his sister as follows. He said, "I cannot believe in God. If there is a God, it is the chemical in your cells, the stuff that holds life together. And sometimes, like when you are hungry or something hurts you very much, imagine I take a knife and, well, there's nothing left inside you. God leaks out. The cells break. Just pain or hunger is left and no space for God." I think there's a whole seminar in that. As a final lamentation of God's impotence, a Norwegian political prisoner, Odd Nansen, who was imprisoned in the notorious Grini prison in Norway. He confided to his diary. He was able to keep a diary. He managed to keep a diary. And in April 1942, he wrote, "If there were a God," he used, by the way, lowercase when he referred to God, "if there were a God, he would be bound to stop this now, at least if he is all they make him out to be. The God of justice, the God of goodness, the God of love. How false and hollow it all sounds today on this background. Who can speak today," Odd Nansen continued, "who can speak today of the God of love, the God of justice? Only Germans." And he ended that with an exclamation point. And then he wrote in his diary, "Good night," after that. Now, while examples such as those I've just related would seem to indicate that concentration camp prisoners rejected belief in God, or rather saw that God had forsaken them, the question must be asked again, I say, how representative are they of the broader situation prevailing across the entire camp universe, concentration camp universe? Did all prisoners feel the same way as those I've just quoted? I think the answer must clearly be no. The occasion on which we see survivor accounts denouncing God and condemning religion in general point to the fact that many inmates who had once adhered to religion at least in some form, now no longer did so. At the very least, their faith underwent a transformation, for many people a negative transformation, even if it did not manifest itself as outright denial. Possibly because of their situation, probably in fact because of their situation, many prisoners had of necessity to focus on the here and now. So what therefore, we would say, did incarceration in the camps tell them about the human condition? One is a search for meaning. The other is the reality that we are all human, that all humans are human. There are no humans more human than others. What did their imprisonment, what did their situation tell them about the human condition? A great many prisoners, former prisoners, have contemplated this in their accounts. If we're looking for a general consensus, this could possibly be summed up in the words of a French political prisoner named David Rousseau. He was liberated by the Americans in 1945. Reflecting on his experience, David Rousseau wrote afterwards, it is still, and by the way, he wrote his memoir in 1945, so not long after he'd been taken out of the camp. He said, it's still far too soon to draw up the positive balance sheet of concentration camp experience. But even now, it promises to be a rich one. A dynamic awareness of the strength and beauty of being alive, self-contained, brutal, entirely stripped of all superstructures, of being able to live even in the midst of the most appalling catastrophes or the most serious setbacks, a fresh sensual feeling of joy arising out of the most scientific knowledge of destruction, and as a result of this, an increased firmness in action and unshakable judgments. In short, a fuller and more intensely creative state of being. For some, it has been a confirmation, for most, a discovery, and a striking one. David Rousseau's reflections are very, very interesting. Looking at survival as an act of revelation as to the human condition. A British prisoner, Christopher Burning, found that in Buchenwald, he wrote afterwards, one found one's fellow men stripped of the frills and furbelows, love that word, of their conditions, and saw their true worth and their true feelings as human beings. Eugen Heimler, a Hungarian Jew deported to Auschwitz in early July 1944, discussed this issue of human character with his comrades in the camp. One of them was a man called Dr. Eckstein. We know him from the testimony he had left by Eugen Heimler as Dr. Eckstein. And he conveyed his opinion with the following. And I'll quote it, it's a lengthy quote, bear with me. He said, what do you think determines the destiny of a person? What does it depend on, whether one is dragged down by suffering or raised to a higher level by it? What decides our fundamental sensitivity or insensibility? Biochemists attribute it all to the hormones, psychologists to early and unresolved conflicts. Sociologists put everything down to poverty and unsatisfactory working conditions. Have a look around. How many of these people did you know back home? Quite a number. Of the good ones, how many have remained good? And how many of them who used to be bad have become human beings here? The concentration camps have created a civilization within a civilization. And in this new civilization, the truths and laws whose validity we have believed in for centuries have been turned upside down. Now, unquote, Dr. Eckstein had a lot to say there. Jorge Semprún, was a Spanish prisoner arrested in France as a political opponent of the Nazis. He saw the issue this way, quote, "In the camps, man becomes that invincible being capable of sharing his last cigarette butt, his last piece of bread, his last breath to sustain his fellow man. That is," he continued, "that is, man doesn't become that invincible animal, that invincible animal in the camps. He already is." Unquote. That's a pretty powerful statement. For the survivors, questions as to the nature of revealed truth, the presence or absence of God, the quality of evil and suffering, and all the words needed to answer them are meaningless without recalling the human dimensions of the concentration camp experience. And in that sense, Semprún, who I just quoted, Semprún's further statement is worth bearing in mind. He said, "We didn't need the camps to understand that man is a being capable of the most noble as well as the basest acts. He was already there." Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. I'm very conscious of the time and I'm conscious of your forbearance with me. In this presentation, I've attempted to build a composite picture, I said that at the outset, of just one facet of the concentration camp prisoners' experience, focusing on some of the reflections, a wide variety of different settings regarding their survival and freedom. For every example here, an alternative might be found. An alternative might be found for everything I've said which would contradict it. A major issue therefore arises over the question of, again, I said before, how representative the accounts are. In my work on survivors, and I should say, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm a historian. Perhaps I look at things from a different perspective, I process this sort of material from a different perspective than what others would from different disciplines. I've dipped into an extensive range of survivor memories. Those I've quoted here are just a sample. I've tried to do so because I want to extract just what it is the survivors have wanted us to know. And what did we learn? We learned just how human the survivors of the camps were. Their accounts and reflections regarding the time of their liberation are nothing other than a reinforcement of that same human spirit the Nazis sought to deny. And in this regard, they underscore the degree to which the basic human values they took into the camps with them were retained throughout their ordeal, right through to the end and into the future. I could keep going. I won't. As I say, I'm conscious of the time. I will hand it back to Sarah at this point, and I'll open up to whatever it is where we want to go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bartrop. It's always such a pleasure to have you speak for us and speak with us and to us. I got so excited to get this started and to introduce you that I forgot to introduce myself. Hi, Sarah Gottwallace, committee co-chair and Holocaust historian. And we do have some questions here for you from virtual land. So first, Gabriella is asking, clearly you have a deep interest in these stories and this piece of history. What started this passion that led to your massive knowledge?
Oh, wow. Well, I mentioned, I'll try to do this sort of standing on one leg, so to speak. I mentioned that I come from a Jewish community that's very survivor rich. I'll use that language and say rich. We're blessed here in Melbourne. So that's something that's been with me within our community for some time. But going back further, much further, 30 years and more ago, we had an upsurge of Holocaust denial here in Australia. My early work had been looking at British appeasement, the British appeasement policy in the 1930s, but we had this upsurge of Holocaust denial in Australia. My thesis advisor said to me from my master's, he wanted me to do some research to try and look at rebutting the various claims they were making. Got into it that way. Best way for me to do that was to look at what the survivors themselves were saying about their experience. That's a really short way of describing something that's a very, very long experience, but I hope that gives at least some little insight there.
For sure, absolutely. And Lester has a very good question. Here's one of the big enchilada questions. You ready? How do you feel about people saying that the Holocaust did not happen after doing research and writing your books on the subject? This is the one
how do I feel? I feel when I go to the doctor. The question is, how do I think? And to tell you the truth, I don't think about them very much because for whatever reason, they've got to want to discount historical reality. That's up to them. As somebody once said, it wasn't me, I'm not that bright. Somebody once said, I think of them as with as little care as if to drink a cup of tea. But it would always stayed with me. It's just not something that is worth consideration, in my view. You know, I don't consider whether or not Columbus bumped into China on his way to bumping into America, nor do I think about whether or not World War I happened or any other historical event that can be easily rebutted.
That's a very good answer.
I don't know.
I think it is.
I've been doing this for a very long time. I've got my battle scars with Holocaust deniers as well. It's not something that's worth getting into.
Yeah, I've encountered them in my own classroom, so they do exist right here in Fort Myers, Florida, even still. So
I don't know. I'm wearing my FGCU top. I know what you mean.
One question that I have for you, because I run into this a lot in my work when I'm trying to teach world history courses and I have students writing about the Holocaust. How do you consider survivor stories? Do you look at them as a primary or a secondary source, and why? And what are the parameters that make it as such?
Always as a primary source. If I know it's a survivor writing about their own experience, that is a primary source. In the same way that a letter would be, in the same way that a diary entry would be, you treat these things with the same measure of historical respect, I would say. That said, sometimes you encounter accounts written by survivors of fictional events.
Yeah.
There's a big debate. Oh, gee, you got me on a roll now, Sarah. There's a big debate about Ellie Wiesell's book Night, for example. Is that a novel? Is that a memoir? Is it a fictionalized memoir? This is not something I got involved in at all, but I've seen accounts where people have discussed this. A little bit of autobiography here. It was my pleasure once, my honor once, to be sitting next to Ellie Wiesell on a bus once upon a time. Circumstances were such that we were riding together for some time on this bus. We were at an academic conference, and I didn't ask him about Night. Possibly you always say that you regret the things you never did. Relative to the question you just asked, it would have been nice for me to be able to tie that one up in a little bow. Because what do you do with things that the author, him or herself, says? This is a this is a version of my story, which is what Ellie Wiesel said about Knight. Well, what does that mean? Because later on, of course, he wrote his autobiography in 2 volumes. Where do you go with that? That's a very long way around answering the question you asked.
It's all right, it works for me.
It's something that I can come back again some other time, perhaps, and we can discuss that further.
Yes, absolutely. Any other questions here? We've got the 2 that were typed out. I'm very conscious of the time though for you.
Thank you, and I appreciate that.
So, oh, we just had one come through. Sandra says, well, thank you so much for sharing about all the survivor stories. You've clearly taken abundance of knowledge in their stories. It's...
Thank you for that.
Yes, yes. So, as I say, trying to be very aware of the time on your behalf. So thank you so much for speaking with us. It's an absolute pleasure to hear and to see you. We're always so happy to have you join us for our Holocaust Memorial Week, and hopefully we'll have very, very many more of these in the future as well. From the land down under.
Wonderful way for me to reconnect all the way from Melbourne, Australia, back to my second home in Fort Myers, Florida as well.
Yes, you'll always have a home here with us. All right.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for tuning in and spending your evening with us as well.
Okay, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.